Thanks, Pam. Good morning. The meeting is called to order. Acknowledge the Commissioners' meeting on Microsoft Teams. I note that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the Commission is meeting virtually. The meeting is being streamed live on the Port's YouTube channel. If you have questions or a comment, please use the raise hand function so as to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. I'll call for a motion and second for approval of the minutes of the regular Commission meeting of March 9th, 2022.
So moved. Second.
Thank you. Pam, if you'd lead us through the vote, please.
Yes, Commissioners Alexander.
Aye.
Kupro-Comas.
Aye.
Lamb.
Aye.
Levy.
Aye.
Nemi.
Aye.
O'Halloran.
Aye.
Semput.
Aye.
And Strader. Thank you.
Thank you, Pam. I'll ask Curtis now to provide the Executive Director's report and remarks.
Terrific. Thank you, Madam President. Good morning, Commissioners. Very nice to see everyone, albeit remotely. I also would like to welcome our new Port employees who are watching this session on the Port's YouTube channel. The executive team and commission officers and I just met with the new Port employees, and it's just always a thrill, honestly, to see the diverse, interesting people who are joining the Port. Really excited to have them on board, and looking forward to having them be part of the team for years to come. I would like to acknowledge the Port's monthly safety champions. I think we can get them on the screen here. There we go. Again, group of employees who are really pushing for safety on the job for themselves and their coworkers and for our customers and partners. Thanks to all of you for really leading the way on safety. Stands out this month, but Steve Danielson is here for the month, for the safety messages month. Are you ready, Steve?
Yes. Good morning, everyone. I'm Steve Danielson. My pronouns are he, him, his. This safety message promotes Distracted Driving Awareness Month. The opportunity is too big to ignore. Even state highway departments are using their message boards to heighten awareness. Driving is the most dangerous activity that most people do. Every day, 8 people are killed and thousands are injured in distracted driving affected crashes. This year's theme, the distraction is coming from inside the car. Touchscreens take your eyes off the road. In-vehicle tech take your mind off driving, making it more dangerous for you and those around you. And the phones. Simply put, hands-free is not risk-free. Drivers need to be aware of the 3 major types of distraction: visual, eyes; manual, hands; and cognitive, mind. At work, our employees often exercise a pre-task plan to mitigate safety risks. A similar exercise can be used before driving to set up your vehicle and phone to mitigate distractions while on the road. Set up your drive while you're still in park. National Safety Council data from 2021 note a 9% increase in motor vehicle deaths over 2020. That is on top of an 8% increase in 2020 over 2019, even though people drove less frequently because of the pandemic. Oh, I said it. The Port is a member of the National Safety Council and participates annually in Distracted Driver Awareness Month. We are having safety conversations with our employees, enabling them to bring awareness home to their families, and educating the public as needed with our traffic patrols. Take action. Inventory your driving distractions and eliminate them. Be aware of inattention blindness and how that can affect your safe driving. Model the safe driver your kids may emulate. More information is available on the National Safety Council website. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve. On to the rest of the executive director comments, starting with PDX Next. Structural demolition of the old Clock Tower Plaza begins next week, and we are just moving ahead with the PDX Next work. That work will continue through the summer, and while construction crews are really making an effort to reduce noise in the building, built extra walls, and we're using thick sound muffling blankets to try to keep that noise down. We are letting passengers know that there are free sensory kits available in the Travel Oregon Welcome Center down near baggage claim. for those with different sensory processing needs. We've got free earplugs in the ticket lobby, and big picture why this is happening, to prepare to install the big new handcrafted wood roof later this year. It's going to be really exciting, but this is a time that's going to be somewhat disruptive. More broadly at PDX, the port is going to receive $3.75 million in what we used to call earmarks, and now we call congressionally directed spending. That's going to help support the final design work on the seismic upgrade to the south runway at PDX, with the goal of making sure it remains functional following a big subduction zone earthquake. The funding was included in the Fiscal 22 omnibus spending bill passed by Congress in March. We're really excited about that, and again, appreciate our congressional delegation supporting this work for a seismically resilient runway. After serious pandemic and recession delays, I'm really happy to say that all 10 of the new Concourse E extension concessions are now open for PDX passengers and employees to enjoy. It's great out there. I was out last week, and I'm just really thrilled to know that we're back open out on E. We took some time last week to say thank you and celebrate with all our concessions partners who really stuck through us during really tough times through the pandemic. On April 21, Age Friendly Portland and Multnomah County's Economic Development and Employment Committee, in partnership with AGE Plus, will present PDX with their 2022 Age Friendly Business Award. Very cool recognition given to businesses or organizations that create welcoming environments and provide great service to people of all ages, particularly older adults. So I'm really proud of the team for the work to continue to make PDX a welcoming place to our entire community. On the marine side of the business, this week, Portland is hosting the 7th Annual International Mass Timber Conference, the largest gathering of mass timber experts in the world, down at the Convention Center. Many of our partners will be highlighting their innovative roles in our new mass timber roof for PDX. And I'm actually really looking forward to sharing some of our Terminal 2 story in a panel discussion about the role of mass timber to really solve big challenges like affordable housing. Internal to the port, throughout the month of April, our internal pop culture team is hosting our annual diversity summit. It's really just a great process, opening of the doors to really understand more about diversity in our communities and in our organization. We've got sessions led by employees, but also a number of external guests, including Randy Blazak on the intersectionality that exists between power and privilege and white supremacy culture. Christina Hauk, who's going to share skills to engage in difficult conversations with compassion, something honestly we could all use a little bit of. And Representative Tana Sanchez and Senator Lou Frederick for a discussion about the emergence and impact of Black and Brown voices in the state legislature. So I'm really excited about a month of activities and engagement. Hope employees are able to take advantage of that. That, Madam President, is the substance of my ED comments for the month. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Curtis. I have to say I flew in and out of Concourse E last week and was super excited about how beautiful it is, and to hear all of the people who got off the plane with me talking about how much better our airport is despite the construction than almost anywhere they fly in and out of. So
I love it. Madam President, if I could interject, I forgot to mention, I read this morning, the White House did extend the mask mandate at the airport for another 2 weeks until May 3rd, just so commissioners and our audience knows. We obviously will comply with all the federal requirements, and so that mandate will extend obviously to the port and PDX as well.
Thanks, Curtis. Obviously, the safety of our passengers and our employees is uppermost, so thank you for sharing that information. Any discussion or questions for Curtis about the Executive Director's report? Okay, hearing none, I'll call for a motion and second for approval of the Executive Director's report.
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? All right, Pam, would you lead us through the vote, please?
Commissioners Alexander,
Aye.
Kupro-Comas,
Aye.
Lamb,
Aye.
Levy,
Aye.
Nemi,
Aye.
O'Halloran,
Aye.
Semput,
Aye.
and Strader.
Thank you. We did not receive any public comments this month, so we will move into our first general discussion item, and I'll call on Bobby Stedman to introduce it.
Thank you, Madam President, and good morning, Commissioners. About 5 years ago, we began kicking off our annual budget discussions with an overview of the economic outlook. You'll recall perhaps last year we invited Josh Lehner from the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis to offer his perspective on the national, state, and regional economic situation as we considered the budget. And I think it's probably of particular interest this year. We're thankful to have Josh come back again by popular demand. His presentations are always great, infused with a bit of humor, which I'm sure we could all use nowadays. So he's going to share his insights ahead of this year's budget presentation. And I'm really going to hand it over to Tim Quayle, who's our Director of Research and Analytics, to do a formal introduction of Josh. So Tim, I'm going to pass it on to you.
Thanks, Poppy. It's my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today, Josh Lehner. Josh is an economist with the Oregon Office of Economic Analysis. He's responsible for developing the state's quarterly economic forecast, which provides outlooks for employment, income, and housing. He also oversees forecasting of revenues for the Oregon Lottery, Oregon Judicial Department, as well as state and marijuana and tobacco taxes. So today, as we hear about our proposed budget, we asked Josh to come and share his thoughts and answer any of your questions about the state of our economy. Josh, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Tim. It's good to see everyone again. Just for the record, Josh Lehner, Office of Economic Analysis, here to share with you some of our latest thinking on the economic outlook. Next slide, please. We're in this inflationary boom. Make no mistake, the economy today is booming. This is the fastest, most complete, most inclusive economic recovery of the last 40 years, probably the last 50 years. I was going back, probably have to go back to the 73, 75 oil shock time period to see maybe a faster economic recovery than this overall, which has some other parallels today with the oil prices certainly going up in recent months. So make no mistake, like this is a very, very strong economic recovery, faster than what we've become accustomed to the last couple of cycles coming out of the tech bust and the housing bust and the like. Those took years and years to recover. This time, we're talking basically a 2-year economic recovery. The economy grew 10% last year. Now, that was more like 6% real growth, 4% inflation. This year, we're expected to grow 9%. Again, this is a very fast growing economy, except this year is more like a 3% real growth plus 6% price increases. That's how you get to the 9%. But the underlying economy in terms of jobs, income, business sales, business revenue, and then, of course, associated public tax collections out of that stronger economy are all increasing quite quickly. Next slide, please. And the main reason for this is household incomes. Household finances are very, very strong. We have booming current income. Wages today, we'll talk more about in a minute, are growing really quickly, faster than we've seen in quite some time, and they're offsetting the direct federal aid. But that direct federal aid that we saw during the pandemic, particularly the CARES Act, the COVID relief bill, and the American Rescue Plan Act, all provided about 25% worth of GDP's fiscal stimulus or fiscal recovery aid into the economy. We've never done that at the U.S. level. We've never spent 25% of GDP over a 12, 18-month period. And particularly, it was primarily just straight cash to households, right? Enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, recovery rebates, paycheck protection program loans that have turned into grants. About 92% of the PPP has turned into outright grants that are forgiven. The other 8% haven't applied for the forgiveness yet. So it's really, we spent a lot of money to save households and businesses during the pandemic, and we have a strong economic recovery to thank for that. And it's not just the cash in your pocket. The bank accounts are up. The accumulated savings during the pandemic is across the board, both low-income households and high-income households. Of course, the greatest dollar amounts are at the high end. That's where most of our income is, most of our savings is at the higher end, but it is across the board. We have seen bank accounts rise. And then, of course, we have record asset markets. Yeah, the stock market's down this year, but it's up over the 2 years. Housing wealth has never been larger in our economy. So there's a lot of sources for consumers to maintain and increase their spending in the face of these higher prices. And part of the higher prices is due to this strong household income growth. And so overall, we're in a situation we haven't been in generations, and we're leaving some rubber on the road, certainly in the inflation perspective, and certainly in some of the other dynamics we're seeing in the economy where the labor market's really tight, much faster than we've seen in recent decades. But overall, it is a good situation to be in. It presents challenges and issues that are different than what we're used to. We're used to very slow economic growth, a slack labor market where it's easy to find unemployed workers and bring them back to work at a discount where you don't have to raise wages very quickly to attract and retain workers. That's what we've become accustomed to really in the last 20 years. That is not what we're experiencing today. So the challenges and the issues and the risk associated with the economy are different. I'd say they're better. They're a better set of challenges to face than the reverse. Now, next slide, please. With the strong household finances, right? We had the money, and we can spend it if we want, by and large, across the economy. And what changed during the pandemic, as you guys are all well aware, is the nature of our spending shifted. We sat at home for a while. We're social distancing. We're still having some of our meetings online, although some of it's maybe weather related right now versus pandemic related. So we stopped doing the in-person activities. We stopped going on vacations for a little bit. We certainly stopped doing long distance air travel for the first year of the pandemic, although that's coming back. We stopped doing elective surgeries because our hospitals were restricted and the COVID wards were overrun. But that has impacts on the economy. And so what do we do? Well, we had the money. We're getting recovery rebates. We're getting enhanced unemployment insurance benefits. We're sitting at home, clicking on our computers, getting stuff delivered to our doors. And you can see the goods numbers there at the bottom, the gray line in the chart. We're still 18% above pre-pandemic expectations, pre-pandemic trends. We're still spending a lot of money on cars, on RVs, on kayaks, on stuff at the grocery store as opposed to going out to eat. We're still doing that in record volumes, record spending on these products. And it hasn't slowed down yet. Or maybe it's slowed down, but it hasn't declined. That's kind of the risk to the outlook is, okay, we're now, we're past Omicron. We're starting to see rebounds in a lot of these in-person activities. Are we going to see a sudden downshift in spending on these physical goods? Are we going to have a manufacturing recession in the next 12 to 18 months? Not an overall economic recession, but for manufacturing industry, are we going to see consumer spending really fall off a cliff here because we're now going to go back on those vacations and out to eat and to happy hours and all that sort of stuff, as opposed to maybe outdoor recreation and e-commerce spending and the like? That is the risk. That's not the baseline forecast you can see here. We think the goods spending is going to kind of taper off and hold steady for the next couple of years, but the risk would be to the downside on that front. On the service spending side, the risk are to the upside, right? We are just now getting back to basically, the passenger count travel data. Our leisure travel's back, but our business travel is not. Our going out to eat is now back. Not in Oregon, not in Portland, but overall at the U.S. level, and certainly in the surrounding communities of Oregon, our going out to eat is all the way back. But that's been a fairly recent thing in the last handful of months. And so as we revert to some of these trends, I think the risk is that they accelerate, and that'll put even more pressure on the economy. If the service spending accelerates more than anticipated, that would continue to put price pressures on the service industry and more pressure on the labor market, because service industries are very labor intensive, right? It takes a lot of manpower or woman power to cook food, to wait tables, to give care at our hospitals and our doctors' offices, things like that. It takes a lot of labor to provide those services. And so if we're all trying to get back on the plane to Cancun at the same time, or go on vacation, or go out to eat again, it's gonna be even more challenging for the firms to staff up adequately to provide those services. Next slide, please. And so in terms of the forecast about what industries are going to drive growth over the next 2 years, both this year in 2022 and next year in 2023, it's kind of a hodgepodge. It's a mix of things, and it's a mix of things because of the nature of the cycle we're in. Leisure and hospitality is expected to lead growth over the next 2 years, both in absolute terms and total number of workers added in Oregon, and in percentage terms, as you see at the top of the chart here. And part of this has to do with leisure and hospitality employment in particular is not fully recovered today, right? It's still down. And so part of this stronger growth is just getting back to where we were 2 years ago, and then kind of net growth on top of that, underlying economic growth on top of the initial rebound phase of the cycle. Whereas like if you flip to the bottom of the chart, you see things like retail and construction. Well, retail, somewhat surprisingly, given, the e-commerce trends in the last 20, 25 years, brick and mortar retail is fully recovered in Oregon from a employment perspective, and of course from a dollar sales perspective. We are buying stuff, and so we're seeing, what we're talking about, slower growth for retail, slower growth for the construction industry. It's because they're fully recovered today. They have no rebound left to go. We're talking about net economic growth, net economic expansion on top of a full employment economy for some of these industries. So that's why they're at the bottom of the chart, not because we don't think consumers are going to spend, or not because we don't need more housing, or we don't need to finish our expansion at the airport on a construction side of things. We need all of that, but they're already at a historic high for employment today. The resources are already being utilized as much as we ever have, and so it's harder to grow. You see slower growth in that situation, whereas the bars and the restaurants still have a ways to go just to get back to where they were a couple of years ago. Next slide, please. The good news here overall for this cycle is as I led off with, for once, it's an inclusive economic expansion, right? When it comes to employment rates and income and wage growth by age, by gender or sex, by race and ethnicity, they're all mirroring the same patterns. We have disparities in our economy, no doubt, right? Dads work a lot more, moms work a lot less because they're taking care of the kids and the family. We put a lot of burdens on moms in our society, and that's certainly still the case. But we haven't seen some of those disparities widen during the recession. What have we seen change would be employment, certainly by educational attainment. And a lot of that has to do with the nature of the shock. We shut down the in-person service parts of the economy, either formally with public health policies or informally as we're trying to social distance and slow the spread of a deadly contagious virus. And so that disproportionately impacted lower wage sectors, which disproportionately impacted workers with lower levels of educational attainment. Now, those widened considerably at the start of the pandemic. They're shrinking today. We're adding a lot of growth in some of these same hard-hit sectors. And if you look at the latest data, the employment rate for Oregonians with just a high school diploma is now back to where it was 2 years ago. So that's encouraging, right? We're starting to make grounds on this educational. Whereas for people with college degrees, 4-year degrees or higher, they're at a historic all-time high. And so we saw some of these educational attainment gaps widen. They're now shrinking again today, but they're still a little bit wider than they were before. So that's really the one disparity we've seen widen during the pandemic would be on the education front, whereas the other factors that we care about from a socioeconomic perspective didn't widen. That doesn't necessarily mean they got better, but it just means they didn't widen during the last couple of years. Next slide, please. Overall, the labor market is tight. Nobody needs to tell you that. It's hard to find workers. We're seeing a record number of job openings. It's important to keep in mind that the record number of job openings isn't some pie in the sky aspirational number. Businesses, as you can see in the chart, it's really if we take the actual number of jobs that people have filled in the economy plus the job openings, it kind of just gets us back to where we were 2 years ago. It's not like businesses are trying to boom per se. They're really just struggling to get back to where they were. So what have we seen? Well, we've seen wages increase quite a bit. The average wage in Oregon today is 17% higher than it was at the start of the pandemic. That's more than twice as fast as you would have thought. Like we were seeing 4.5% average wage growth in Oregon pre-pandemic. And so maybe we would have seen 8% over the last 2 years. That was our old forecast. Our pre-pandemic forecast would have been 8% average wage growth. Instead, we've seen 17% average wage growth because businesses are struggling to bring the workers off the sidelines and bring them back into an economy, frankly, where the consumer demand is really strong. But then maybe some of the fearfulness of workers is like, I don't want to go work in that in-person service sector that has been hard hit economically and has been hard hit by COVID, and you're interacting with customers, and part of your job also had to be being the mask police, telling your customers to put their mask back on. There's those factors. And then of course, you didn't have to work financially if you didn't want to because of the enhanced unemployment insurance benefits, the recovery rebates, and all the stuff we're talking about before. It meant you didn't have to work just to put food on the table. And so I think all of those factors have made for the tighter labor market than you would think coming out of the deepest recession we've seen in our lifetimes. Next slide, please. You put this all together, and I think this is the key economic chart today, would be the labor income, right? The average wage is up 17%, but we still have a jobs hole. We still have a couple percent left to go on the employment front to get back to historic all-time highs for the total number of jobs in Oregon. But the income, the aggregate wages, the increase in consumer power, consumer spending, household finances on the right has never been higher, right? You can see our current forecast is steeper, faster, quicker than we've ever had before in Oregon. Despite the jobs hole, we have never had a higher income forecast for what Oregonians are expected to earn in the years ahead. So there's certainly been a big shift, particularly in the labor market. And that's really good news for households. And it's really good news because of the next chart. Is the next slide, please, is inflation, right? So as we've seen this really fast economic recovery, we've definitely left some rubber on the road, peeling out, getting back to where we were. And you can see that on the inflation story. Now, initially, you could say a lot of our inflation was tied to very specific issues in the economy. We had the semiconductor shortages that have driven automobile prices up 40%. We've had some pandemic affected services. So when we reopened the economy, airfares, hotels, rental cars, like those prices really rebounded quickly a year ago as people started to do those again a little bit more. And then more recently, we've had food and energy shocks with particularly with the war in Ukraine. And so we have these known issues that are driving overall inflation very high. Somewhere in that 8% range is where we currently are for inflation in the economy. By far the fastest we've seen in over 40 years. We have not seen inflation like this in a lot of, certainly in generations. And so has people concerned. But then also people are talking about, well, we're going to see a slowdown, right? Some of the car prices are going to come off. Just last month, car prices declined 3%. But of course, they went up 40% and now they've come off 3%. Like that will help with inflation. But that's not really what's happening. It's that kind of that blue part of the chart, the all other category. The underlying trend in inflation in the economy has certainly picked up. It's somewhere probably in that 4 to 5% range. And the challenge is the Federal Reserve has a 2% inflation target, and the underlying trend is probably 2, maybe 3 times faster than that target. And so what do we do? Well, the Federal Reserve has pivoted as hard as they can for a bureaucratic agency that doesn't want to react too quickly to things or irrationally to things. They're raising rates faster, expected to be higher than they ever thought before. And so they're probably going to raise interest rates up to 2.5% this year, maybe a little higher next year, maybe 2.5 to 3%. That's somewhere in the range of what economists think is called the neutral rate of interest. The neutral rate is when monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, is neither stimulating the economy, adding fuel to the fire, or actively restricting the economy, right? And somewhere in that 2.5% range is what a lot of economists think today. So the Fed's going to raise rates quickly to about 2.5%, and then kind of see what happens. Is that going to be enough to slow inflation fundamentally back to something that they're willing to tolerate? Even if it's not 2% again, maybe it's 3%, are they going to tolerate that? The question is, the risk is, A, in the near term, this has real consequences on the economy. Inflation is not costless. 80% of workers in the last year have seen their wages erode in an inflation-adjusted terms. They're seeing wage growth, but that wage growth isn't keeping up with inflation. So 80% of workers are seeing a decline in their standard of living people don't like that. We've seen the consumer sentiment data. We've seen the all that sort of consumer sentiment type data is pretty pessimistic. People don't like that. And so that is a challenge from an economic perspective. Eventually, if prices get too high, people stop buying as much. That's called demand destruction. That means like, yeah, I'd like to buy that, but the prices are too high. And it's more of an inflation story than just I can't afford a BMW, so I'm going to drive my Honda, right? Like it's not just, you know, coming down the price tiers due to your income situation. It's due to the fast rise of prices means we're actually buying fewer goods and services because of that. So it's a different dynamic than just that. And that's something to keep in mind. We're not seeing that today in the economy, which is good news, but it's certainly a risk to the outlook. And then the challenge is does the Federal Reserve need to raise interest rates, say above 3%, 3-4% at the Fed funds rate level, which would imply mortgages of 6, 7, 8%, depending upon how financial markets react. Do we need to see that to actively slow the economy, to actively bring inflation back down to something tolerable and manageable? And if so, the risks become, once you have restrictive policy from the Federal Reserve, that's when you tend to see recessions happen historically. So they're going to raise interest rates to neutral. We're going to see if inflation slows. If it does, great, we're off to the races. We're going to continue economic expansion. If they need to push it higher to actively bring this inflation down and cool the economy, then the recession risk might increase moving forward. That's something to keep in mind. That is not the baseline outlook. You can see here, we say persistent inflation is a moderate risk. It is not hyperinflation. We're not worried about a recession in 6 months or 12 months or something like that. This is going to be a 2-year process probably before we know for sure exactly how it's going to play out. And so we'll go from there. We're in this economic boom today. There are the risk of a boom bust cycle a year or two down the road, but it is not guaranteed at this point, and it's something that economists and certainly the Federal Reserve will continue to monitor. Next slide, please. The last couple of slides I have, I just want to touch on some of the regional, local issues. It's something where I would say the conventional wisdom is much more pessimistic than it probably should be from an underlying economic perspective. And part of that is large urban areas in the country are lagging economically, right? Unlike last cycle, in the 2010s, last cycle, large urban areas were the growth leaders. They turned around first following the housing bust. They saw the best growth. Portland in the 2010s was top 10 nationwide for high wage job growth, gains for the median household income, and increases in things like educational attainment. And so like all of these really good things we care about economically, Portland was a national leader in that. And now we flip that on its head. The large urban areas across the entire country are some of the slowest growing parts of the economy. And Portland, as the chart shows here, Portland is right in the middle of the pack when it comes to employment, right? Out of all the large metros in the nation, Portland and Seattle are basically right there at the median, right? Half of large metros are doing a little bit better. Half of large metros are doing a little bit worse. The challenge is while I led off with the large urban areas are lagging, we have a couple of them that aren't. And those couple that aren't would be like Austin and Salt Lake, which are the two fastest growing large metros in the entire country, among the two fastest growing metros of all sizes in the entire country. And those are some of the peer comparison metros for Portland and Seattle for that matter. And so relative to some of these comparison metros, we are lagging a little bit, which is unusual. But we're still 2 years into the cycle. I think we'll have some catch-up growth over the next couple of years. But maybe this cycle we're going to grow slower than anticipated, or certainly slower than last cycle. And part of that has to do with the next slide, please. Is population growth, right? Population growth is probably Oregon's comparative advantage. It's the reason why we grow faster than the nation over the long haul. And a lot of it has to do with who moves. Who moves is predominantly 20 and 30 somethings. These are people that are starting their careers. They're bringing their labor with them. It allows our local businesses to hire and expand at a faster rate than pretty much any other state in the country, or at least among the top handful of states, faster than the rest of the country. And what happened during the pandemic is we saw a slowdown in population growth. And depending upon the source you want to look at, the Portland region either saw small increases in the population last year or small decreases in the population last year, depending on if you're talking about the Portland state estimates or the Census Bureau estimates. But either way, can't rule it's small. It's a small change no matter what. So you can rule out there was no pandemic migration boom. Unlike places like Idaho, Montana, Utah, and Arizona, which saw an increase in population growth during the pandemic, the West Coast saw a decrease. California saw larger out-migration. Washington and Oregon saw slower in-migration than we did in the years leading up to the pandemic. And so we didn't see a pandemic migration boom. This will have some repercussions. The other thing I would add is that the population loss story, if it's actually true, these are estimates, we'll see how true it is nationwide. It is an urban core phenomenon in blue states and in red states. Some people want to make this out to be a blue state thing, but hip, popular, cool metropolitan areas like Portland, Seattle, Denver, Minneapolis all lost population. The urban cores all lost population last year, according to the Census Bureau. But it wasn't just that. It was Atlanta, Orlando, Birmingham, Nashville, right? Like some of these really popular, fast-growing Sun Belt metros, Dallas as well, they all lost population in the urban core last year as well. So it is an urban, rural, suburban thing. It is not necessarily a blue state, red state sort of thing. Moving forward, we have population growth increasing because migration is rebounding. Migration is pro-cyclical. More people move in good economic times. We've already seen it turn around in the surrendered driver's license at the DMV. When you go to a new state, you have to give them your old license to get your new one back. Those have turned around quite a bit in the last year, and they've really accelerated. So I think this rebound in migration isn't just wishful thinking and based upon our models of the economy. It actually is happening on the ground as we're seeing the surrendered driver's licenses increase. Next slide, please. Last thing I would say is we know housing matters. Housing supply matters. Housing affordability has been at the top of our list of risk to the economy, certainly in the last cycle. And there's two things. One is worse housing affordability impacts our local households. You have to spend too much money on housing relative to other places in the country. That means you have less money left over to put food on the table, to invest in local companies or other things, right? Like other types of spending. And so that's a burden on our households. And we have that burden on our households across the entire distribution. Low income households pay more to live here than other places in the country. Middle income households pay more to live here, relatively speaking, than other places in the country. And our high income households, while if someone who's making six figures or more might not necessarily, need a lot of rental assistance, they are still paying a much larger share of their budget for that housing to be local as opposed to in some of these other places around the country. And so it is across the board. The needs are greatest at the lowest end because there's less wiggle room. If you're living paycheck to paycheck and barely making ends meet, or you're not even doing that, that is where the greatest housing need and financial assistance need is today. We see that in our homeless numbers, where it's tautological, but the reason that people are homeless is because they cannot afford a place to live. There might be mental health issues, there might be substance abuse issues and the like, but the underlying reason is that housing is too expensive. Other places in the country, be it Appalachia, be it the Midwest, some of these places that have a lot of poverty and a lot of substance abuse issues, they don't have the homeless numbers we do because their housing is also affordable. So people can have a roof over their head while they struggle to address some of their personal situations. So that's just a part of it. That is the ultimate cause of a lot of this. And that's part of the reason why housing is so important. Unfortunately, housing is supply constrained. We've underbuilt for the last couple of decades. Our forecast you see here, we have a 10% increase in housing starts in Oregon over the next handful of years. That doesn't really address the shortfall. To address our housing shortfall, we really need to see a concerted effort to increase our abilities to produce more housing units. So that includes workforce, that includes our land available lands to build on. That includes our permitting processes to streamline it so that it doesn't take months and months just to get the approval to do these sort of things. We have to see a concerted effort on all of these different constraints on the housing market before we're going to say we're actually going to build enough housing for once in Oregon. We haven't done it for 20 years, so why are we going to start doing it tomorrow unless we start to fix some of these supply constraints in the economy? And so unfortunately, that's not necessarily a good story. The other thing, so to finish, the last thing, we can go to the next slide, please. Last slide. The reason why it is a risk to our forecast and to Oregon's economy is there's the first part about we're overburdening our households with too much housing costs. The second component is housing affordability doesn't tend to make people move away. People don't generally move away per se, but it is an initial repellent. If people are like, hey, I'm 22 years old, I just graduated college, I'm going to move somewhere. Am I going to move to Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Montana? Like, where am I going to move? And housing costs come into play at that initial step. And so if our housing is too expensive, it's an initial repellent on population growth. And so we've seen that, where that's the risk, that we'll see slower population growth in the years ahead, which means our overall economy will grow slower in the years ahead than we're currently anticipating. And part of it has to do with the relative housing affordability. That is the longer term risk. The near term risk is we can't make ends meet at a household level. The longer term risk is it repels people away from Oregon and pushes them to places like Idaho, Montana, Utah, some of those places that saw faster population growth in recent years. The other chart on the left, specifically for Portland, well, our relative housing affordability gap has closed in a bad way with like Austin and Boise. Those prices have skyrocketed even more than ours. So what does this do? It probably pushes people further down the spectrum. It's probably quote unquote good news. It's not good news, but it's going to increase growth in Salem, Albany, Eugene, Spokane, Idaho Falls. Like, it's going to push people to some of those secondary markets because the primary markets are too expensive. And so with that, I'm out of time. Probably went over time. If there's questions or time for questions, I'm happy to stick around. If not, next slide, please. Here's my contact information. I'm always happy to chat. Always happy to come back. Reach out to me privately. You know, anything Oregon, economic or revenue related. I'm always here to talk. So I appreciate your time this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Again, I really appreciate these presentations. I think they really set the table well for our discussions about the budget and frankly, all of the work of the port. I know you mentioned several pieces here that I know we're working hard to think about and think about how we can affect the community in a positive way with our work. So want to open for any questions from the commission for Josh. Okay, seeing none, I again really appreciate the time. I know that we will all spend a lot of time processing the information that you've provided and thinking about it and how it affects support and frankly all of the places where we engage as community members as well. Thanks for all of your time and work on this.
Thank you.
Thanks. With that, I'll call on Antoinette Chandler, who will introduce the next agenda item.
Thank you so much, Josh, for your comments, and good morning, Madam President and Commissioners. We're delighted to be here today to present our fiscal year 2023 proposed budget. This morning, I'll briefly talk about how the port is positioned for recovery and growth and provide you with a high-level overview of how we have allocated resources that are aligned with our strategic priorities. And then Fran Breeding will walk you through the fiscal year 23 proposed budget and discuss our business outlook and activity forecasts before presenting the operating and capital budget. Next slide, please. Next slide. As one of our guiding principles is financial responsibility, we've taken a thoughtful and measured forward-looking approach to this year's budget as we continue to manage through a number of critical external factors such as air traffic recovery, the economic effects of the prolonged pandemic, labor shortages, and inflation pressures, all of which have had an impact on our financial performance. And Josh earlier just pointed out a number of economic trends, and I just want to focus on a couple of key favorable economic indicators and highlight how they're pointing towards continued recovery and future growth for us both regionally and nationally. Josh talked about personal income. Our region has a higher per capita personal income as compared to the U.S., and our region really focused on the 7 counties, continues to experience population growth, and I target really that 35 to 40-year-old category, growing much higher than the U.S. And interestingly, that age demographic has a higher propensity to spend on air travel and is growing at a faster pace than the U.S. And we believe that will continue to bode well for the future of travel at PDX. Another important driver for us is the fact that our regional business climate continues to be attractive with a diverse employment base with a broad national and international reach. And I also just point out that the most recent unemployment in the state was hovering around 4%, which Josh touched on, has recovered significantly since the height of the pandemic, which reached a high point of just over 13%. However, along with lower unemployment, we're experiencing higher inflation, again, with the most recent consumer price index increasing to over 8.5%, which is one of the highest year-over-year increases we've seen since the early 1980s. As a result of this current market environment, our fiscal 23 budget contemplates these inflationary pressures, which Fran will address during her review of the operating and capital budgets. And I just want to make a final note here that we are definitely keeping a close eye on just the geopolitical market factors, the risk factors that are really increasing the uncertainty that is causing just continued supply shocks, increasing commodity prices, and the like. All of these we view as continued headwinds that potentially could prolong the timing of full recovery, particularly to pre-pandemic levels in terms of our employment activity. And so again, we're just keeping a close eye on that, just recognizing that that's out there. In terms of our financial position, the good news here is that we entered the pandemic from a position of financial strength. Managing through this recovery, we've remained nimble and agile. We've stayed focused on executing our business strategy, managed operational costs commensurate with conservative employment forecasts, and prudently applied our federal stimulus funding to preserve our liquidity position, all of which has positioned us well for growth. We've demonstrated financial resilience managing through these effects, and as a result of these efforts and our management's commitment to financial responsibility, S&P recently upgraded the port's credit from A+ to a AA-, which is where we were pre-pandemic. PDX and Terminal 6 serve as our primary cargo gateways, and they're critical for connecting Portland to the Northwest and the world, and in transporting people and goods to and from a vibrant economic region. Air cargo at PDX has seen extraordinary growth in the years leading up to and during the pandemic. Terminal 6 is poised for more growth to continue providing diversified shipping options for the region. And further evidence of this is the fact that MSC, the world's largest container carrier, has taken notice of the regional opportunity and started weekly Trans-Pacific service to Portland starting in 2022 this year. And Portland also has established itself as a gateway for handling 53-foot containers for major retailers and large trucking operations. Given the significant investment to expand capacity at our Portland bulk facilities at Terminal 5, this year's budget is forecasting higher potash volumes than last year. And I think really our overall outlook for fiscal 23 is more optimistic than last year. And I believe that the net effect of these favorable economic trends supports our decision to strategically allocate resources in this year's budget to position us for continued recovery and growth. Next slide, please. This slide really just illustrates how our strategic priorities are reflected in this year's budget. We're increasing staffing to provide a better customer experience and keep our travelers as safe as possible. And the key operational areas where the port has added staff includes public safety and security, and also maintenance, given the new terminal facilities that have come online with Concourse B and Concourse E. As noted earlier, this year's budget factors in inflationary cost increases related to our primary services contracts for landside management services and for custodial services. In terms of building quality jobs, our budget includes making investments to support our trade and equitable development division to further refine the port's economic development strategy and to continue evaluating regionally significant port assets that can be leveraged to deliver shared prosperity throughout the region. And in doing so, one of the key outcomes we seek to achieve is increasing quality jobs and improving economic outcomes for underrepresented communities in an inclusive and equitable way. And the investments that we're making at Terminal 2 is a great example of the opportunity we have to deliver shared prosperity on a transformational level. In terms of our marine business, we're allocating additional resources to keep pace with the continued growth of our container business. As mentioned earlier, we're forecasting significant growth in vessel container volumes at Terminal 6 due to the regional demand and continued West Coast port congestion and demand for 53-foot containers. In terms of continuing to be a learning culture and inclusive, the key message here is that we're investing in our people in an equitable and an inclusive way. And this year's budget reflects our commitment to employees to increase training opportunities through the development of a port-wide learning and development program. We're also allocating resources to develop an enterprise-wide business intelligence program to improve our data analysis and enhance enterprise-wide our strategic decision-making process. So I'm really excited to bring this budget to you today. I'm excited about the future of the port, and I believe that our fiscal 23 budget reflects our commitment to manage resources responsibly and to position us for future growth. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fran Breeding, our interim budget financial planning and analysis director, to walk you through the budget. But before I do that, I just want to thank Fran and her team for all their hard work, for just doing an outstanding job to bring this year's budget forward today. Thank you, Fran, for all your hard work, your leadership, and your continued dedication to the port. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Fran.
Thanks, Antoinette. Good morning, commissioners. I'll start with our business lines outlook before walking you through the details of our financial summaries on the operating and capital budgets. So next slide, please. Our aviation business line outlook for fiscal year 23. The bottom line is, we are not fully recovered. However, we continue to see steady growth. Some of the key factors influencing our forecast for fiscal year 23 are really just business travel continues to lag through this recovery. We don't expect to return to pre-COVID levels until at least fiscal year 24. And that really presents a challenge for a strong business market like PDX. Also, our international traffic, that's expected to take even longer to recover to pre-COVID levels. Right now, kind of conventional thinking is that won't be back to pre-COVID levels until about fiscal year 25. Just, world regions recover at a different pace than the United States. That said, we are expecting the return of our 4 transatlantic flights in fiscal year 23. So London, Amsterdam, Frankfurt, and Reykjavik. So that's good news. A little more uncertainty on the timing of return for our Trans-Pacific flights. Our budgeted enplanements for fiscal year 23 are at $8.2 million. So that's around 82% of pre-COVID levels. But again, still, projecting steady growth over our current fiscal year, up about 17%. Landed weight in total projected to be down about 7% compared to pre-COVID, but up 12% from where we forecast will end this current fiscal year. The breakdown between, it's passenger landed weight where we're still, not recovered to pre-COVID levels, but still forecasting growth there. On the cargo landed weight side, up 34% compared to where we were in fiscal year 19, our pre-COVID baseline. And again, that kind of ties in with Josh Lehner's points around the sort of goods versus services growth in the economy. But we do really, you can see that projection or the increase compared to our current fiscal year projection is only 2%. So we do kind of expect to see cargo get back to sort of more normal economy-based growth over the next few fiscal years. Next slide, please. For our marine business line outlook, we're forecasting growth really across most of our business lines. Before kind of walking through each of our different individual lines of business, I just want to remind everyone that our revenues generated in our auto and bulk lines of business are much less sensitive to volume fluctuations. We either have guaranteed minimums in place, and of course ground rents, so that insulates us from some of that volatility with volume fluctuations. However, our Terminal 6 container yard, our revenues and expenses do fluctuate with fluctuations in volumes significantly. So that's our containers and our BNSF rail moves. For grain bulk at our Terminal 5 facility, forecasting an increase of 12% up to 2.8 million metric tons. Grain can be difficult to predict as our operator there has the ability to route their cargo through their Kalama elevator, so also on the Columbia River. Mineral bulk forecasting to increase 9% to a total of 8 million metric tons. We have potash within this line of business at Terminal 5, so that's Portland bulk. We're forecasting a 24% increase here to 4.2 million metric tons. That would actually be a record high volume if we hit that next fiscal year. They've really made a lot of significant capital improvements and rail improvements over the last year and a half, really increasing that facility's capacity. Soda ash, so that's Kinder Morgan at Terminal 4. We're projecting just a slight decrease in those volumes, about 100,000 metric tons or 3%. And that's really just due to market uncertainty with Chinner leaving the soda ash consortium. Again, very little revenue impact associated with that slight decrease in volumes. Our autos, we're projecting to be flat with fiscal year 23, relatively flat. On BNSF, rail moves, so again, that's Terminal 6 container yard, projecting about a 40% decrease in volumes. However, that is more in line with current fiscal year performance. So, again, that's really been due to supply chain issues have really impacted the availability of rail equipment. So just impacting their ability to move containers between Portland and the Puget Sound. And then finally, kind of containers, or vessel containers, were projected to more than double our volume at Terminal 6. But again, similar to the BNSF rail moves, that's much more in line with current fiscal year to date performance. We're on track to probably hit about 70,000 containers at Terminal 6 by the end of fiscal year 22. Part of the reason the fiscal 22 adopted budget volumes are so low, we were conservative in that projection because at the time we adopted the fiscal 22 budget, we did not have established MSC service, 53-foot service. as well as the significant number of charter vessels that are calling at Terminal 6. Next slide, please. So for fiscal year 23, we are, looking at a significant FTE increase, up 70 positions or 9%. But again, this really reflects the strong employment recovery for PDX, the continued growth of our container volumes at our Marine Terminal 6, as well as just changing business needs across the enterprise as we continue to sharpen our focus on shared prosperity. Couple of quick data points. I'd say about 90% or 64 of these positions are in PDX, Marine, and our support services departments. And about 25% of the total FTE increase is actually the return of positions that we temporarily eliminated through our early retirement and voluntary separation program. We implemented that in fiscal year 21 as a cost savings measure in response to COVID-19. So we're just seeing these positions come back online. Diving into PDX, we are looking at almost a 43 FTE increase. And again, about 2/3 of these positions are really the addition of frontline staff in our public safety and security departments, our consolidated communications center, and maintenance. And again, that's really just addressing operational risk and in some cases systemic understaffing in these areas, and also just increased maintenance associated with bringing some of these new terminal facilities online. So Concourse B, E, and Consolidated Rental Car Center. The other third are those early retirement and voluntary separation programs. For Marine, we're increasing FTE by 10. These are really nearly all of these positions are due to the increased volume at Terminal 6. And then finally, in our support services divisions, looking at a little over 11 FTE increase. Almost half of those are the early retirement voluntary separation program positions. And then the other half are really just new FTE, just better positioning these departments to provide the level of service to our business partners, primarily these operating divisions, and also just the implementation of the port-wide kind of BI, business intelligence and data analytics program. Next slide, please. So here we have the PDX financial summary for the operating budget. You can see here total operating revenues are increasing almost 30 million or 11%. That is really just commensurate with our employment recovery. Non-airline revenues are, largely driven by our employment forecast. So most of that increase that you're seeing in the non-airline revenue, it's 26 million. Most of that is parking. For our airline revenues, again, those revenue streams are actually due to the residual nature of our airline agreement. So it's really cost recovery for our terminal and airfield cost centers. So we're actually looking at an increase of 4 million in airline revenues. On our operating expenses, increasing 22 million, about 15%. Again, inflation is a key contributor to our expense growth in nearly all of these areas. So personnel services increasing about 8 million. Again, that's due to the new FTE that we reviewed on the previous slide, as well as just salary and benefit increases for existing staff. Our materials and services expenses increasing about 12 million. I just want to point out here about 40% of this kind of expense category is labor associated with major services contracts for airport operations. So our custodial services, our landside management services contract for parking and our shuttle bus operations, and then security services. So there's kind of two main drivers for that 12 million increase here for these services contracts. And one is just really restoring levels of service to pre-COVID levels. if not exceeding that, just again, to deliver an exceptional experience for our passengers, but also just living wage increases and inflationary pressures on those service contracts. Finally, just PDX's share of overhead is increasing a little over $2 million. And that's primarily due to, of course, salary and benefit increases for existing staff in those support services departments, as well as the new FTEs and investments in our port-wide BI and data analytics program. Debt service and coverage increasing $7 million or 7%. And just, how our operating revenues, expenses, and that debt service and coverage translate into our key metrics for PDX. For our airline cost center net requirement, again, that's what, really the airlines will owe to the port. For fiscal year 23, we're projecting that net requirement to be a little over $150 million. It's an increase of about $6 million or 4%. And our port cost center income is projected to be a little over $6 million. That's an increase of a little more than double. And again, just want to point out here that some of these comparison points are a bit distorted because our fiscal 22 adopted budget did not actually reflect our ARPA funding. We were still working through our strategy on how to apply our ARPA funds between fiscals 22, 23, and future fiscal years at the time we adopted the 22 budget. Next slide, please. Our general fund financial summary. Again, for our operating budget, I'm primarily going to focus on our marine and trade and equitable development divisions here. They generate the majority of our general fund revenues. So our total marine and TED revenues are increasing almost $8 million or 33% in our fiscal year 23 budget. On the marine side, the revenues are increasing almost $19 million. That's really, again, the result of the increased container volumes at Terminal 6 and the uptick in potash volumes at Terminal 5. For our TED division, we are looking at a small contraction in revenues here, and that's really a result of Daimler exercising their purchase option for their headquarters facility at Swan Island. So while we are sort of seeing those lease revenues go away, we did in March, close on that land sale and received about $16 million in net cash proceeds from that sale. And our combined marine and TED operating expenses are increasing about $20 million, almost 40%. In fiscal year 23, again, on the marine side, those operating expenses are increasing about $18 million, and that's largely due to the new FTEs, and then, of course, the increased longshore labor associated with the increased activity. And our trade and equitable development division operating expenses are increasing $2 million. And again, that's really just reflecting the strategic investments we're making in Terminal 2 towards the development of a mass timber campus and a workforce training program. So kind of going down to the bottom line, our combined marine and TED operating income before depreciation is a positive $1 million. And again, just, a decrease of almost $2 million, primarily just as we ramp up our investments in T2 for shared prosperity. Next slide. Next slide, please. I think can we go back one? I think we skipped the aviation capital program. So our 5-year CIP forecast for fiscal year 23 capital outlay is estimated at about $415 million. And really, it's no surprise to any of you, but the main focus of our capital program in fiscal year 23 and over the next couple of years is really delivering on our PDX Next capital program, and specifically the redevelopment of Terminal Core. Next slide, please. On our general fund capital program, our 5-year CIP forecast is just shy of 200 million. Estimated outlay in fiscal year 23, a little over 50 million. A few of the project highlights, we do have 2 significant capital projects at our Hillsboro General Aviation Airport. Both of those projects will be primarily funded with FAA project here, but the total project cost is around $21 million. Substantial completion is expected in fiscal year 23. And our runway safety area improvements project, that outlay is about $8 million in fiscal year 23, but again, total project cost a little over $19 million, with substantial completion also in fiscal year 23. And then finally, Berth 410 pier replacement. So this is where Kinder Morgan operates at Terminal 4. Our fiscal year 23 estimated outlay is about $4 million here, but it's a much bigger project. Total project cost estimated at almost $19 million, with substantial completion estimated in fiscal year 26. Next slide, please. And finally, just this is the calendar of key review and approval dates as we move through the budget process. Today we have, our tax supervising and law on June 8th, immediately following the Port Commission meeting. Staff and commissioners will meet with TSCC for their review and public hearing on our budget. We do expect to receive TSCC's approval of our budget. Finally, in late June, subsequent to TSCC approval, we'll request that the Port Commission formally adopt our fiscal year 23 budget. That's it. Kind of open it up for questions if folks have any.
Thanks very much, Fran and Antoinette and all your teams. I know this was difficult work and a heavy lift, particularly in a year when there's so much uncertainty around both the pandemic and the economic effects. And appreciate that you've been conservative in thinking about those and about how the recovery might go. I want to open for questions or comments from the commission. Commissioner Alexander. Okay, Commissioner O'Halloran, please.
Thank you. I just want to acknowledge the work that's been done. Getting a little bit of an echo, sorry about that. And just understand that inflation plays a huge role, and that I'm confident that we're being effectively managed. So thank you for the good work.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Yes, Commissioner. I'll ask those who are not speaking to mute, please, so we can avoid the echo. Any other questions? Commissioner Alexander, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also want to offer my appreciation for the detail and the thoughtfulness that went into this. And clearly, looking back and looking forward, there are known and unknown impacts. I'm curious as to the degree to which the continuing, evolving, and concerning world scenario around supply lines and trade and potential spheres of conflict sort of come into your thinking around what the next 12 months will look like. I'm sure it was taken into consideration, but is it something that you continue to track on? And in some ways, how impactful might it be under a worst case scenario?
Yeah, Commissioner Alexander, thank you for the question, and a very good one. And I will just say, you know, what's heavy on my mind is thinking about it in three ways. Economically, given all the geopolitical risk, again, the inflationary pressures, we've talked about a number of the kind of red flags, if you will, or just things to watch over the course of this call. I think for me, what I'm really paying attention to is the Fed. I'm paying attention to how their monetary decision-making potentially could impact what type of economic landing we have, whether it's going to be a soft landing, whether it's going to be a situation where we find ourselves in, and Josh touched on this a little bit earlier, if the Fed does move to raise rates between the 2 to 2.5% to moderate inflation, and we still are not fighting inflation, and we find ourselves maybe in an environment where there's stagflation. How do we think about that, and what impact is that going to have on some of our forecasts around employments, how travelers will spend, and continue to, activity. So I'm thinking about that, and then I'm thinking about deflationary or recessionary months. And I think in the short term, our strategy, again, like I mentioned earlier, is to just stay nimble, stay agile, keep watching the metrics, make sure that we're making decisions to preserve our liquidity, make sure we're staying on top of, what the changes are potentially in the business climate. And if we need to pivot, we have certainly, I think, over the past 2 years, demonstrated very competently our ability to make any adjustments operationally, whether it's on the expense side, to adjust to the changing market conditions. So all of that is top of mind. All of that, we are constantly, just so you know, running different financial scenarios that can give us the slight indication that maybe it's time to have a broader conversation and pivot. So that's where we get back to making sure that we're coming before you all with quarterly updates and making sure that we're continuing to inform the executive team on what we're seeing economically that may impact us financially, that gives us the opportunity to maybe rethink our strategy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you for that response. I think we all are concerned about all the unknowns here and appreciate all of the planning and thoughtfulness that has gone and will continue to go into the budget and the planning on behalf of the port. Any other questions or comments? Okay, seeing none. Following this presentation, we'll open a public hearing and ask for testimony. We'll wait a few moments to ensure that folks who are participating have an opportunity to comment if they so wish. Is there anyone who wishes to comment on the port's proposed budget? Pam, please do let me know if we've received any comment during this public hearing period.
Madam President, there are no comments.
Thank you. We'll close this public hearing. No action is required from the commission at this time. The proposed budget will be back before the commission for action at the May 11th meeting. Thank you. We'll move on to our action items, and I'll call on Dan Pippinger for the first agenda item.
Thank you. Good morning, commissioners. This item is a follow-up to a contract that came before you in February. and it requests approval to enter into an easement purchase agreement for off-site vegetated corridor mitigation for the runway 13 right, 31 left, and runway safety area improvements at Hillsboro Airport. As part of the permitting process for the runway and runway safety area improvement project, the port is required by the local water resource management utility known as Clean Water Services to mitigate and enhance vegetated corridors that are impacted. Because these corridors are wildlife attractants, which are incompatible with airfield safety, the mitigation must occur off-site. Here to introduce the item and present it for your decision is Maureen Minister, the Environmental Conservation Manager, and Eric Forsyth, the Engineering Project Manager, to present the recommendation to enter into an easement purchase agreement to provide the vegetated corridor mitigation. Thank you. Maureen and Eric.
Thank you, Dan. Good morning, commissioners. You can go to the next slide, please. My name is Maureen Minister. I use she, her pronouns, and I have been working on this project for several years. I worked on the NEPA environmental assessment, and I'm also leading the natural resources permitting effort. As Dan said, we're here today to request approval to enter into an easement purchase agreement with the Dairy Creek Mitigation Bank, LLC, for off-site vegetated corridor mitigation in the amount of approximately $576,000. Next slide, please. Since the project is occurring on an airfield, we can't mitigate on site. It can attract wildlife and it can also create obstructions which are hazardous to aviation. The project requires over 11 acres of vegetated corridor mitigation. The mitigation must occur within the Tualatin River Basin on a site that meets specific criteria. These requirements made it challenging to identify a viable mitigation site that was large enough. So for several years, we explored mitigation options and partnerships with public agencies, environmental nonprofits, and private developers in an effort to identify a mitigation site that would meet all of the requirements. The Dairy Creek Mitigation Bank property was identified as the preferred location to satisfy our mitigation requirements, and this location has been approved for our use by Clean Water Services. The map on the slides shows the location of the mitigation bank in proximity to the Hillsboro Airport project. Next slide, please. Per the easement purchase agreement, Dairy Creek Mitigation Bank will grant 2 easements for the port's vegetated corridor mitigation area. One will be the port and one for Clean Water Services. The easements will protect the mitigation area in perpetuity by restricting future uses to just those associated with habitat enhancement and vegetation management. Dairy Creek Mitigation Bank will be responsible for all of the short and long-term management of the easement area, including design, implementation, maintenance, and monitoring. Mitigation site management can be costly and requires a considerable amount of staff time to implement. Partnering with another landowner to implement our required mitigation results in significant cost savings to the port over time in comparison to conducting mitigation on property that we own. To ensure that our permit requirements are met, 50% of the payment to Dairy Creek Mitigation Bank will be withheld until the enhancement work is completed. This ensures the site meets all performance standards before the final payment is made. The cost of the mitigation easement is $47,000 per acre for up to 12.25 acres. The current project only needs 11.13 acres, so the remaining acreage can be used for future Hillsboro Airport projects. However, this will not satisfy all of our future mitigation needs. We anticipate in the next 5 years that the Hillsboro Airport will need between 4 and 10 additional acres of vegetated corridor mitigation, depending on project timing and impacts. Given the challenges we had in identifying suitable mitigation sites for this project, we're exploring mitigation opportunities now ahead of those future airport projects. At this time, I'll turn it over to Eric for information on how this fits in with the overall project budget and schedule for the RSA project.
Great, thank you, Maureen. It's a nice description of the upcoming purchase agreement. Here before you is the overall schedule for the project. As Maureen mentioned, we've been working on this project for quite some time, since 2017. We've been before the commission 3 different times before this. Most recently back in February for the personal services contract for final design services. We intend to proceed with final design leading up to future commission action first part of next year for the construction contract. as well as probable final design contract amendment for construction administration services, leading us up to construction in 2023. Next slide, please. Here you have our budget and funding summary. Not much change since February. We have our easement purchase agreement in there. Contingency at this point is stable at 20%, which is appropriate for the preliminary nature of the design up to this point. Funding will come largely from the FAA AIP grant, about 70% of the project from that grant, which will be solidified first part of next calendar year, early part of the year after bidding occurs, and then the remainder will be from Port Cost Center. Next slide, please. Staff requests approval of the Executive Director's recommendation.
Thank you for the presentation. Any questions or comments? Okay, seeing none, I will call for motion in second. Oh, I'm sorry, Commissioner Alexander, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much. Actually, one quick question. I saw in the financial summary, I didn't see a reference to any small business participation. And I know this has come before us previously, and you probably addressed that, but could you just provide a little context?
Yeah, maybe can we go back to the budget and funding slide, please?
Yeah.
Yeah, we didn't include, there's quite a bit of echo that I'm hearing. We didn't include any small business goal in this case because it hasn't been determined yet for construction. That won't happen until first part of next year. When we are done with our design, we have our final construction cost estimate published, and we're ready to form the goal for the construction phase of the project. However, we have formed a goal for design services. I'm not remembering what that was, but that was presented back in February. I believe, sorry, I'm not going to try to remember that number, but our design services consultant is bound by a goal in their contract, which was previously determined through our small business program, and they are currently on track to meeting that goal. But to your point, the heavier hitting item will come up less than a year from now, and we'll discuss that in future commission items.
Great, thank you very much. I vaguely recall the reference in previous iterations, but I just wanted to inquire. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. We'll be discussing it in future commission actions.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? All right, seeing none. Commissioner Alexander, did you have something further?
No, ma'am. I'm just slow to get my hand down.
No problem at all. So seeing none, I will call for a motion in second for approval of the Executive Director's recommendation.
So moved.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, Pam, would you lead us through the vote, please?
Yes, Commissioners Alexander,
Aye.
Kupro-Comas,
Aye.
Lamb,
Aye.
Levy,
Aye.
Nemi,
Aye.
O'Halloran,
Aye.
Sumput,
Aye.
and Strader.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll call on Sean Loughran, and apologies if I've mispronounced, please correct me, to introduce our last agenda item.
You got that right, which is rare. So good work so far. Thank you and good morning, commissioners. I'm Sean Lochran. I'm the Planning Development Director for the Port, filling in for Stan this morning. This agenda item requests your approval to award on-call pavement maintenance service contract on an as-needed basis. I'm sure, as you know by now, the Port maintains a lot of pavement throughout our facilities. Many of these locations are in need of pavement maintenance to extend the life of the existing asphalt areas. This on-call contract will allow for timely maintenance of these areas as they are identified. Through the recommendation of our Shared Prosperity team, this project has been selected as a pilot for an update to the non-public improvement on-call contract process. The proposed process will require that small business goal be negotiated for each scope of work issued under these contracts. That goal will then be included as a requirement in the resulting task order. Janelle Brannon, our engineering project manager, will present the recommendation to award the on-call contract. Janelle?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Today I'm requesting approval of 2 contracts for the on-call pavement maintenance services as needed at Port facilities. Next slide, please. This on-call contract will have a term limit of 5 years and will be an option for Port projects delivered throughout the Port. Work for each project will be issued an individual task order that specifies scope of work, schedule, compensation, and SBE goal. Each contractor recognizes the Port's overall goal and the importance of partnering with SBE companies. Throughout the course of this contract, the contractor and the Port will work closely together to ensure that each project has an appropriate SBE goal and continued coordination to achieve that goal. Next slide, please. The scope of work for pavement maintenance projects will be determined based on the condition of the existing asphalt. Typical pavement maintenance work will include seal coats, grind and inlay, and asphalt overlays. By maintaining the existing asphalt areas, the life of the existing asphalt will be extended. Next slide, please. The on-call RFP solicitation and selection occurred earlier this year, and the term limit for this on-call contract is 5 years. Next slide, please. Staff request approval of the Executive Director's recommendation.
Thank you very much. Question from me just on the small business participation. If I understand correctly, we'll be determining the appropriate goal at the time any one order goes out. Is that correct? Or for the year, or how will we do that operationally?
Yeah, for each project, we'll have a scope of work determined, and with that scope of work, we'll assign a SBE goal.
Thank you. Other questions or comments from the commission? Okay, seeing none, I'll call for motion and second to approve the Executive Director's recommendation.
I so move.
Second.
Thank you. Any further discussion? All right, Pam?
Commissioners Alexander,
Aye.
Kupro-Comas,
Aye.
Lamb, Commissioner Lamb, Commissioner Levy,
Aye.
Nemi,
Aye.
O'Halloran,
Aye.
Sumput,
Aye.
and Strader.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you very much, everybody. That comes to the conclusion of our meeting. The meeting's adjourned, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.